สวัสดีค่ะ Good evening สวัสดีค่ะ Dear members and guests, welcome to our joint SPE CPEX monthly meeting for July. It is great to finally be here at our home venue, seeing each other in person. For those who do not know me, my name is Sujintana, or you can call me Ning. I'm a member of the SPE Thailand board and here to help running the meetings and support the section as an industry liaison. You know, the SPE mission is to entertain you, and the CPEX objectives are actually very similar. So our combined meeting should hopefully create a bit more understanding from an exploration perspective. The visions of both societies are to make you happy. That means giving you food and drinks, meet new faces, and keep the lights on in the kingdom. So tonight, similar format. We will start with section announcement updating you the SPE Thailand status, followed by the presentation by our guest speaker, which is the main program of this meeting. Once the speaker has answered a few questions, we will then move on with the closing remarks, then the lucky draw. Tonight, worth mentioning a new feature of our monthly technical program introducing the YouTube and Facebook live broadcast. This is a trial attempt at while adjusting to the new normal. This initiative is based on our two recent webcast sessions over the past months, not only assessing larger audience, but also creating opportunity for people who is unable to make it here in person. SPE Thailand section valid membership number as of July is 670 people, combining 338 professional and 335 student members. There are 30 new professional members joining us. Note that we have almost 200 professional members from 2019 who has yet to renew. May I remind you to check your membership status. If it lapsed, please consider to renew. And to all of us, please invite a colleague to join meetings. Even better, join SPE and C because we all need new members. SPE Thailand is still the largest professional oil industry organization where you are regularly meet and greet. On the topic of SPE membership, there are plenty of reasons why you should valid status, even more reasons. I'll not go through all of them as you can see, but worth mentioning that the key benefits of belonging to one of the most active section in Southeast Asia are the regular opportunity for their knowledge and socialize with people in our industry. These companies are the sponsors who support us. Our Thailand monthly. I'd like to see your name here for the upcoming season that will start in September 2020, August 2021. Please reach out to us. We appreciate your support and our society. I would like to add, for those of you who please contact our two ladies at the registration table so they can assist you with the receipt. Without further ado, let me go to our Vice Program Chair, Ajahn Yikot, who will do the honor.
Good evening, ladies, gentlemen, distinguished guests. My name is Igneous, Vice Program Chairman, Scholarship Chairman. Kun who is our Program Chairman, couldn't be here tonight. He's out of town. Obviously, he'll be here next time. So let me introduce our speaker tonight. Chris Marlin received his PhD in structural geology in 1983. He worked for many oil companies internationally, such as Amoco Health. He also do a little bit of teaching at the University of Brunei, Chiang Mai University here in Thailand. He is currently working at PTTEP. He's working as exploration geologist, structural geologist, and senior geophysicist. He worked in many parts of the world, such as in Indonesia, in Morocco, Myanmar, and many more countries, Southeast Asia. He has published over 200 peer-reviewed articles in international and special publications. The topic of presentation tonight is igneous intrusion-related petroleum system potential in Thailand. Without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Chris Marlin.
For the introduction and for the opportunity, I guess, to be the first speaker after the end of this lock-in in Thailand. Not sure how long it will last. So, igneous intrusions, I'm sure they're a topic that's dear to your heart when it's petroleum exploration. This is an area of Thailand that I've been quite fond of going to. It's Saraburi. I go there mostly for the deformation in the limestones, but there are some nice intrusions here. So here's a more sill-like intrusion. Here's another one that's sitting on top of it, and there are dikes feeding it. And so how do these systems, igneous rifts, impact the petroleum system? So I'll go through some of the characteristics of intrusions, seismic data, then focus on the Wichanburi sub-basin, which my co-author has been working on for his PhD. So he gave me the opportunity to learn more about this. The hair trigger on this. So we'll look through the basin, migration, maturation, reservoir, folds, and then at the end, what kind of potential field size might find on the upside with the those familiar with the Murray Basin know that it's barrels, which is a on land, but can we get better? Okay, so igneous intrusion, they're high amplitude reflections. They can be conformable to the reflections photography or cross-cut it. They're much denser than the surrounding rocks, and they have higher velocity, so they have the ability to quite prominent reflection. And very often, where we see them well in sedimentary basins, we find that they're not just flat line features parallel to the section, they're actually saucer shaped. Take these saucer shapes, half saucer shaped, or gently inclined features. As we saw in the introductory slide, they can be fed by dikes. Why does a dike turn into sill? It's usually because there's some kind of mechanical discontinuity, change in the interface between soft and so dikes may propagate across the contact if it's efficient, they collect into it. And sills can be fed from the side, or they can be fed by dikes from underneath. Where they have this saucer shape, they tend to have a parallel section, then a transgressive section, then they may pass up that line. And they can form networks. They don't necessarily need to be fed by dikes, they can be fed by sills. Here's a simple example on seismic. We see the sill here. It can be hard to tell sometimes whether they're lava flows or sills, but where they're transgressive and they're intrusions. And very often we get these faults developed above them, and the uplift, of course, is thickness sill. And where there's no anisotropy to the basin faults to guide them, very often are saucer shape, because in that view there. So these force folds that develop above the sills, they may form at the same time as the sill proves, in which case there'll be a paleo surface, then that feature will be on that. So we can tell from the stratigraphy whether they're membranous or intrusion. In other cases, it may be that there's a compaction effect, metamorphism of surrounding rocks, and so the thickest part will pack less edges. So after deposition, they get action scraping. I first started looking at these features and how sills interact with intrusion with the data set from Taranaki government. Basically, free all their, a lot of their development. As in Chiang Mai, this was a good opportunity. Exploration data free, and here we've got this volcano sitting of the basin, and with a bit of imagination here, you can interpret networks of sills feeding volcanoes here, and the high amplitude sills you decide for white volcano. Some work that's been done on the attributes. There's been a number of authors who have looked at this, and this is the same volcano, the core of volcano in the subsurface, and the attributes show a lot of features of the cone. On one side, there are well-developed landslides, lumps coming off the cone, such as features here. And on the other side, it's dominated by pyroclastic flows. And the Kora volcano, the first well that was drilled, Kora 1, actually recovered 668 barrels of oil per day over 254 hours from the volcanic section on this side. And there's been attempts to follow up to see whether this is a viable exploration target or not. The two wells had shows, and then the well on this side was dry. And those of you who are familiar with drilling volcanic edifices, this unfortunately is a common problem. You get some encouragement of being able to trace out the reservoirs, exploit the accumulation over a significant distance, problematic. So this is the core of one well, the volcanic section here, sedimentary section below, sedimentary above, and they use the hydrocarbons from this interval. And within these volcanic clastics, there's tough breccias, volcanic conglomerates. So not necessarily lava flows, more the pyroclastic deposits on the side. There's actually good porosity and good permeability, but tracing these things laterally is a problem. So we can map a horizon across the volcano, and we get to see the nice volcano shape with no data area in the center. Underlying this is a Cretaceous to early tertiary rift system, and so we can map out rift structures below that. And within this rift system, there are sills, and so the sills can be mapped out, and they form this ring shape around the volcano. So I'll just show you some seismic lines through that. This is a seismic line running northeast southwest. We can see a few sills. The rift structure is quite clear. Now a line in the opposite direction. We can also pick up the rift structure with a lot of sills that are starting to mask structure. And as we progress towards the volcano, of course, the intensity of the sills increases. They're particularly concentrated in this interval, that's the source rock interval. It has the mechanical contrast between basement and the overlying sediments. That mechanical discontinuity attracts sills. They also tend to follow faults. And then closer to the volcano, we see the sills rising through the section. We start to see the forced fold above these sills that runs into the volcano. So we can build up this kind of picture for the interaction between the rift structure, the networks of sills, and ultimately concentration of sills running up to the volcano. From the exploration point of view, this is Cora 1 that had the oil within it here, then Cora 4 that had no oil in it. It's thought that maybe there's a leaking fault from the source rock down here that was supplying the hydrocarbons in this section. But this fault was a barrier, and so there were no hydrocarbons coming into this section. But given the presence of intrusions can also affect migration pathways. This is an example from the Faroe-Shetland Basin, where we have intrusions coming up faults, then a sill sitting in here, the source rock is here, so there's migration up to here, but then the sill is taking most of the hydrocarbons around here, not so many are migrating vertically, and so there is a shadow zone above the overlying sill complex. When we look at petroleum plays within a volcanic sequence, we can break it out into three basic types. One is the intrusions that underlie the sequence, and that's what I'll be focusing on. As we just discussed for the Cora volcano, we can look at the volcanic edifices themselves, and there's a number of examples around the world where volcanics lava flows, pyroclastics. And then there's the sections such as carbonates or sands pinching out onto the volcano that are affected by the edifice but not directly related. Country that's really focused on exploring for hydrocarbons, I think because in part there's a lot of onshore rift basins in China. And in recent years, this is 2005 to 2008, goes back to 84, you can see there's the odd discovery of hydrocarbons in reservoirs. But more recently, China's really been focusing on this sort of unconventional reservoir and its potential. Okay, so with the Witchenbury Basin, we're focusing on the feeder systems, these intrusive complexes that create hydrothermal systems, maturation of source rock, and the intrusives themselves can act as reservoirs on occasion. So the key elements of this hydrothermal system, heat source, the magma. We need a reservoir that can be the sedimentary section, or it can be the fractured igneous rocks themselves. One important component is water. These basins, particularly in the upper kilometre or two where you have intrusions, there's a lot of water in the section. And you can create hydrothermal circulation, and that's important for raising the temperature of the surrounding rock and cooking a lot of the source rock. We need a permeable network for the fluids and for heat transfer. This network can be around 220 to 350 degrees above the background temperature. And that's because, particularly if you've got basalt intrusions, they're extremely hot. They're intruded around 1,100 degrees centigrade. On the downside, if you get these systems intruded into carbonates, then they may end up being very CO2 rich. In organic rich rocks, we may also have a CO2 problem, can generate a lot of methane, but also H2S. This is an illustration of where the hydrothermal systems may be concentrated. So we have a sill here. At the tip of the sill, we've got the contact aureole, and then boiling and degassing, creating vents to the surface. And in this example from Norway, there's a sill here, high amplitude sill. It's created forced fold above the sill. At the tip here, we see that there is a fluid pipe, and we have a hydrothermal vent complex developed here. And just in this layer, there's a small gas accumulation in forced fold, which lies above the sill. Okay, so coming to the Witchenbury Basin. So the Witchenbury subbasin is here. These colours are extrusive basalts. So we've got an 18 to 24 million year volcanic field below, a somewhat younger 11 to 9 million year volcanic field above, and in the middle we've got the Witchenbury Basin. Plenty of other neogene lava flows outside of the sedimentary basins, but the older ones are preserved within. And we find also in the Superior Basin 13 to 24 million year intrusives, and in the Pisanulok Basin 10 to 18 million year intrusives. So probably the rift faults have created a fracture network that have enabled the volcanics to come up through the rift system but the thermal anomaly that creates the melting is much larger, and these volcanics stretch all the way over to Vietnam. So it's a very large province of hot mantle, actually, the generation of these volcanics. So the Witchenbury sub-basin, it lies not necessarily on the suture zone, but a zone of weakness that's related to the Indocinian deformation, and it's following that. We have the Meiping fault zone and the that's coming in here. This seems like a fairly standard extensional rift. It's difficult to see too much strike slip deformation. And the fault trends are generally north-south, but they range between north-northwest, south-southeast, and north-southwest. The study area is right at the south here. So, looking at the fault patterns in the basin, we have an early set of faults that are quite long, the early rifting phase. And that probably was due to east-west extension, maybe northeast, west, southwest. There's some oblique trends that are probably following fabrics in basement. And we see the faults are generally north-south. And then there's a slight change in the overall alignment of faults to a more north-northeast trend. During the second phase, the faults tend to be shorter, and the second phase is 60 years biasing, and that's probably in response to a rotation in the extension direction to a more northwest southeast. And in this later fault trend, we see a variety of fault orientations. Structurally, how we might explain these when we see this change in orientation. There's a variety of explanations can be made. Force tailing along a strike slip fault, the influence of pre-existing fabrics, local stress rotation, or a two-phase extensional system, east-west and then northwest-east. And for this basin, we think this is the explanation. So looking at the stratigraphy of the basin, it's developed over predominantly Permo-Triassic rocks with an Indocinian fabric imposed on them. There are some sands, alluvial fan-type sands early on, but the basin is dominated by lacustrine sediments from the Oligocene to the Pliocene. There are some sands, but one of the problems with exploration in this basin is that the sands are thin, and they're actually not the best reservoirs. It's actually intrusions that are somewhat better reservoirs than the sands. So we have intrusions at various levels, and we also have flows. One of the challenges is to distinguish flows from intrusions. This is the early stage of extension here, then changing to the more northwest southeast. Again, this is just more detail showing the volcanic province in the south, the volcanic province in the north, and the overall younging of the igneous activity towards the north. Cross section through the basin, it's really quite a simple basin, has intrusions in many parts of the basin. And the old work by Pan Orient, this was summarized and published by Barr and Cooper. There were some radiometric ages made of these intrusions. And we know that they run from 24 million years until less than 5 million years. Some are extrusive, some are mostly basic, so basalts and gabbros. On seismic data, these intrusions show up as high amplitudes, and they have a variety of geometries. They can be concordant. There are a few saucer-shaped ones, but not so many. Slightly transgressive ones that follow fault planes over a short distance. And then these ones down here, you see that the section is arched above them. There are these forced folds developed above the intrusion. And they may be stacked sills, or they may be more laccolith type geometries. And so Sopon, for his thesis, he mapped the shapes of all these intrusions. We find that the sills are generally elongated in a north-south direction. Sorry, these sills here. And they follow the trend of the faults. The Cora example that I showed you earlier, this is the trend of the faults. The trend of the sills is more diverse, probably because it's around a major volcano. These are not around major volcanoes or influenced by the local structure. And this just summarizes the shapes of the sills. They can be round, become more elongate. They can start to develop irregular shapes and fingers. They can be saucer-shaped, somewhat transgressive, and then we have others that are domal and laccolith shaped. So a variety of geometry. A common feature with these intrusions is that towards the edge, they tend to break up. So they're continuous here, but here it's starting to break up. And these are called steps, broken steps, and ridges. So they're all part of they connect up along strike into an individual flow, but towards their edges, they can break up. So in outcrop, you'll see things like this, where they've got a thick sill, there's still a thin sill here and another thick part here. And they give us an idea of the flow direction of placement, which is parallel to the elongation. And in this diagram, there's noted fluidized coal surrounded by a magma finger. This is a thin sill, but it's fluidizing the section above and altering it because of this hydrothermal effect, the heating up of. A couple of examples from the Supinburi, Wichambury sills here. You see there's a sill breaking up here, and this is breaking up into these fingers. And it tells us the direction of placement parallel to this is an outcrop model. 1 kilometer by 100 meters here, drone image from Argentina. And this has been modeled on synthetic seismic to show how this geometry might be imaged on seismic. And of course, where there's a big velocity contrast between the sills and the sediments, we get quite a good image. Can't spot all the gaps in the features that easily. Hard to tell the thickness of the sills, but we get a good idea of the general geometry. But of course, as the velocity contrasts decrease, then it becomes a lot harder to identify the geometry of the sill. And here we have an example of that problem from the Pisanulok base. We've got a shallow sill here, and that's probably absorbing energy, so we don't get such a good image here. We have quite a strong amplitude here that indicates the sill, quite a strong amplitude here, but the shocker is that that's actually a sill. And we only really know that because there's a well drill. And it's internally layered, which makes you think that it's sediment. But this is actually a 200 meters thick sill. And you can see by the B response, the BS response, this interval, 200 meters thick, is this interval. And so if you feed this information into the data, this is an acoustic impedance volume here. The sill, when you propagate the properties along this thing, the sill stands out, but it's been masked because of the surrounding geology. So you can have some surprises in the basins. And 200 meters thick sill is an impressive piece. Coming back to the Witchenbury Basin, this is 3D seismic volume and the sills that have been mapped on it. So can we correlate them? Can we tell differences? Well, there are differences in velocity between some of the different bodies, and we have the ages on a few of them. This is gamma ray. So between the gamma ray and the velocity, although there's quite a spread in some of these velocities, there are certain fields that we use to distinguish the igneous bodies. And we can use things, radiometric dating, height in the stratigraphy, the timing of forced faults, some geochemical correlations and well log responses, so that we can begin to distinguish between the ages of the different intrusions. And so our estimate of the distribution of them, these are the very early ones, 23 to 17, not too many, quite widely scattered. 16 to 11, well, at 16 million years, there's a particularly strong concentration, two different types. Then 12 to 13 million years, there's another strong concentration. And then looks like it starts to move north, some more focused, 7.6. And then there's very scattered activity in Pleistocene. Okay, so this is the main study area, and this line runs through a bunch of wells here. The deep data is not very good, but the shallow data is good enough. And here we see a fold, a well with igneous intrusion in it. Looks like a lacklith here. And when we look at the wells, if you look at the sonic log, it's quite slow here, and then it becomes fast over quite a thick interval here. This is 300, and then we hit the sill. This interval is the baked zone. Zone of hydrothermal activity possibly as well. Some of the zones are quite narrow, but some are quite thick, so it's quite variable. This is an example from East Greenland. Satellite images, the scale here is 400 meters. And this white area around it shows the baked zone around the sills, and you can see that it's quite variable. The rule of thumb, usually based on variations in vitrinite reflectance, is that the width of the thermal aureole of these sills is 0.5 to 5 times the width of the intrusion. So it can be highly variable, in part depending upon whether there's hydrothermal activity. If there's a lot of fluid in the rock, and that fluid gets circulating, then you can increase the width of the altered zone. And that gives you, if this is within source rocks, then it will mature those sources. This is an example from west of Shetland, from the Rockall Trough. Rockletop, no, Western Shelf. And here we see vitrinite reflectance up here, indicating very high temperatures. This is the normal background geothermal gradient and typical. And this elevation here is related to intrusions and hydrothermal activity related to those intrusions. This injected fluidized host rock right against this igneous sill is an indication of the heating that occurs locally around it. So in a conventional hydrocarbon system, we'd expect oil window and a gas window that's horizontal. If we take this system and then intrude it, then the intrusions completely change the maturation profile. It can become quite vertical in places and, of course, quite localized, where we go from the oil window to the gas window. This bit of source rock here may be matured and help fill this structure that was immature under this system. The oil that was here may get cooked by the igneous intrusion, this converted to gas. Of course, there can be leaks as well and breach created by this. Now, if we go to Argentina and the Neuquén Basin, which is famous for the Vaca Muerta and the unconventional prospective. There is an igneous association with that. There are a number of sills that have intruded the source rock. This is the Vaca Muerta in the Jurassic. It's been intruded by Eocene laccolith, and there are reservoir rocks in these Cretaceous limestones within the laccolith and within the Jurassic. And the system associated with these intrusions is 20 to 30 API oil. The reservoir is fractured, overpressured laccoliths. Within the largest fields, there's 129 million barrels, and the source rocks 125 meter thick of 3.5% TOC source rock over an area of 5 square kilometers has been matured by the intrusions. And of course, reservoir trap formation and migration, they all occur at the same time. Migration is just a few meters to a few. And so this system, there are 3 major intrusions. This one, obviously, the largest, over 500 meters thick. And the reservoirs are above, but also within the laccolith. And the vitrinite reflectance above 3, below 0.5 here, and you can see how rapidly the change in maturity occurring around this laccolith. For the Witchenbury Basin, we can imagine a similar type of thing. When we look at the overall burial of the base of the basin in the deepest part, it's barely got to 3,000 meters. So it might be mature in the deepest part very late by conventional burial. But much more likely is that during the main phase of intrusions, which is during this time, the hydrocarbons were generated by the igneous intrusions when the basin was only a maximum of 1,500 to 2,000 meters deep. The sediments were probably quite water rich, which would have enabled the circulation and maturation of the zones of source rock. In terms of the reservoir, there are some sands, but most of the reservoir comes from fractured. The best reservoirs are the fractured volcanics, and these are some image logs through the volcanics showing the very regular fractures found in parts of these intrusions. And these are generally probably cooling fractures. Some may be related to faulting, but they're so regular that they're probably cooling fractures. And here's some examples of what cooling fractures in large intrusions look like. You can get columnar jointing, but there's other geometries that produce different orientations of cooling. And even in a Triassic dike in Saraburi, here's the dike sitting in here between the limestones. You can see that there's different orientations of fractures in the dike. Groundwater studies also show that quite shallow fractures in dolerites can actually produce much higher transmissibility than in the shales or in the sandstones. In terms of the intrusions generating structures, there are 5 major faults that we could identify on the seismic. Early on, I was arguing with SOAP on, well, maybe some of these are inversion structures. We know there's significant inversion structures in some of the sedimentary basins in Thailand. But they're all very similar. The relief on these folds is 200 or 300 meters, never more than that. We do see onlap onto these structures that gives us the timing. They're of a fairly similar area, up to maybe 15 kilometers, and a lot are less than. The imaging isn't so good that we can see the intrusions causing these faults quite often. But they are all of a very similar character. Here you see a series of them. So one argument could be these are inversion structures, normal faults have been reversed. These tend to be asymmetric, and the relief on these tends to be many hundred meters, whilst in this case it'll be 100 to 200 meters. And in the case of the Bow Rang field, we have a well that demonstrates what described a long time ago by Riemann. So there is this 200-meter thick laccolith intrusion here. This is a younger one, 11.6, and it's folded these older gabbros overlying it. So this is quite clearly the intrusion that's causing this force fold. This field is still producing. It's quite low rates of production, 400 to 500 barrels of oil per day. These thick sills, they're often not just one event. They're often multiple events, but they can develop rapidly over weeks or months. They don't necessarily take years or years or. So coming to to summarize this, where we've got a rift basin, we can have flows at the surface, we can have intrusive complexes. The sills will tend to follow interfaces such as basement sediment interfaces, interfaces within the source rock. Once you establish a sill, that becomes an interface itself, so the sills may just start to follow each other as they get successively intruded. And we can have laccolith type intrusion well. Um, because there are multiple phases of intrusion, we may locally metamorphose some areas, create the initial forced faults, and then we have a later set of intrusions in slightly different places, which may mature different parts of the system. They may enhance the existing force faults, or they may reduce their amplitude, so there can be destruction or enhancement. One final example, Bohai Bay. This is a rift system. A sill, the scale here is 200 meters, so it's not a particularly large system. There's a very narrow zone around the sill of hornfels, and then a broader zone of what they call carbonite, which is the metamorphosed source rock. And from this system, the sills are 120 meters, 110 meters thick, and there's about 37 million barrels of oil on them. Now, this kind of system, if we were lucky onshore Thailand, it exists. And 10 million, 20 million barrel field onshore in Thailand wouldn't be a bad system to discover at all. You need quite thick intrusions, 100 meters plus, within the source rocks, and you may mature a zone of maybe up to 100 meters, 50 to 100 around those. So requirements for a significant intrusion-based petroleum system, thick sills or laccoliths, preferably 100 meters, 200 meters. Intrusion into thick source rocks, but preferably they weren't buried too deep, so they're still water rich, which gets the circulation of hydrothermal fluids and maturation of water intervals. Storage of hydrocarbons can occur in fractured intrusions, and also in the adjacent contact metamorphozones of the shells. So ideally, you'd want to deviate a well that would be subparallel or parallel to the sills and lakes. And then there's also the possibility of the force folds offering other objectives. Okay. So probably don't need to go through these conclusions because they were summarized in the last couple of slides. Well, I think I will leave it there and thank you for your attention. Thank you to
Any questions from the audience? I see many geologists here tonight. Just raise your hand, please.
I'm not a drilling side, so I'm not a geologist. But it was very interesting stuff. But it seems like these volcanic reservoirs are pretty much small stuff, that's 35 million barrels.
yeah.
Is it worth the effort these days? Not putting down volcanics.
At minus $20 a barrel, it clearly is not worth the effort. But onshore in Thailand, I don't think you'd turn down a 10 or 20 million barrel field, would you?
Considering all the politics and you better get out while the going's good.
It's annular basin, okay, in conventional reservoirs, so there's probably a higher chance of success. But looking for smaller accumulations of that.
But like you said, the Nukin Basin in Argentina,
Yeah,
that's very interesting.
that would be better.
The connection.
That would be better.
Yeah, exactly. That's the.
Yeah.
Thailand is also interesting, but there's, like you said, the kind of logic, but at the same time, with economics.
And this is not a new idea. I think it was Pan Orient who already got the idea that in which Burian went looking, say, in Campaign Pet Basin, try and pursue. But with better quality seismic, it might be worth.
Better quality being 3D.
Yeah.
They only
And just better resolution.
Any more questions? You can see her, but she's in the back.
สวัสดีค่ะ Suvarna from Chevron Thailand. In one of the seismic picture example that you showed before, you describe it as a low frequency seismic feature on those fields. Is it because it's a gas field in those fracture, or is it because some lithology?
No, it'd be nice if there was a gas field in that. No, there's nothing in that as far as we know. It was just a surprise when it was drilled because it looked like it was sedimentary section. And then what's this 200-meter sill doing here?
Well, I'm Warapat from Chevron. I have a question that a very good idea, but what the information you need more to prove your idea and to be a business success?
Well, you just have to decide to go for it, I think, and to shoot the seismic where you can identify these features. If you've got a forced fault, that's obviously a more conventional target that you could try and go for above an intrusion and try and do a 2-for-1. But basically drill the source rock and go low angle when you get in the source rock close to the intrusions, through the intrusions, and see if you get anything.
One last question. Anybody?
One more question. Do you believe that this opportunity can be developed like a shale oil or shale?
Well, that's really what it's like. And we know that very tentatively there is consideration of unconventional exploration of the source rocks in Caribbean, Thailand. And one of the problems is maybe that they're not brittle enough. But here you've got a process that makes the source rocks brittle. So it's not necessarily the intrusions, but maybe the brittle source rocks above those intrusions could enhance the potential for the unconventional exploration.
You might have one last question.
More about the reserve of for next 5 years in vision.
No, but it's small. It's small.
For estimate.
I don't want to say too much. Less than 10. Less than 10 million for sure.
Great prediction on that. Well, thank you very much, Chris, Molly. On behalf of SPE Thailand and SEAPEX, I have a small token of appreciation here to you. I'll give the podium back to Kun Ning. Please, Kun Ning.
And now a few closing remarks before we go to our lucky draw. Next month in August, this is a slot for SPE AIPN, committed to share with us by Kun Joseph from Tamati and Gibbons. Yes. In September, the new SPE monthly meeting season begins, and we will kick this off with the speaker, Kun Pongsatorn from PTT. In October, we will not be having the SPE Distinguished Lecturer. However, we will have a local speaker, so please stay tuned for the announcement on our website, and we'll announce more next month as well. And as you know, OTC Asia 2020 is going virtual, so they're postponing from August this year to November. Please find more information on the OTC Asia website for more details. And our neighbor society, the SPE WLA conference in Bangkok is no different. They're also postponing the event from March to August at the same venue, the Jasmine City Hotel. You can find the latest information and the new program date at their website, or please email them at ap2020@spwla.org. Last but not least, there are multiple ways to get in touch with us, SPE Thailand section. You can go to our official website at thaispe.org to find more information on the upcoming events, new announcements, young professional student scholarship, online webinar, and many more. Follow and like us on Facebook at Society of Petroleum Engineer Thailand section or SPE Thailand. Friend us at LinkedIn and join the group at the SPE Thailand section. What you can also do is to use your mobile phone to scan this QR code shown here on your screen. It will direct you right to what I have just mentioned. And finally, our lucky draw. Can we please have Kun Chris? Kun Chris have